Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Thank you so very much for being with me. Well, like I said, I had a fantastic weekend in a lot of ways, just very relaxing. My wife and I took a couple of days off. Went to a swap meet in Springfield, Missouri. Really had intended to get together with our good friends, the Ruperts up there. But you know, this old age business, by the time we got up there, got set up, we were absolutely, completely, totally wiped out. We went back to the room, went to bed early, and same thing on Friday. I mean, I don't remember being that tired, after being at the swap meet and dealing with everything. I just so horribly disappointed that we couldn't get together with our friends. When we left the swap meet, we grabbed a bite to eat, went back to the room, and we crashed. I don't know how long I slept, but I crashed. Man alive. So, anyway, good to be back with you here on Tuesday morning. We are continuing our examination of the fact Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is broadly considered by virtually everyone to be the same coming of the Lord as Matthew 25, 1 to 13. The second coming. The second coming for the wedding. Okay, I've been sharing with you and trying to demonstrate that this whole, pardon me, came back to the allergies. This whole motif of the wedding and the wedding banquet, not just the resurrection banquet, but the wedding banquet. We covered the concept of the resurrection aspect of the banquet over the last couple of videos. Well, now we want to take a look at this concept of the wedding. We've already touched on it in Matthew chapter 22. We've already touched on it in Matthew chapter 25. But I want to come now to the book of Revelation. And here's what happens. It is a classic example of the doctrine in which I was personally raised, and that is that God was through with Israel at the cross. God was through with the old covenant at the cross. Beginning on Pentecost, God was dealing with Israel, with the church. And as I've shared with you, some take the position, well, God betrothed the church to Christ on Pentecost. The wedding doesn't take place until the second coming. Well, that would certainly agree with Matthew chapter 25, 1 to 13, Matthew 25, 31 and following. Others take the position, no. God married the church on Pentecost, which makes you wonder when the betrothal period was, doesn't it? But anyway, there is tremendous confusion over the issue of the wedding, the marriage. So one of the reasons that I wrote this book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, the wedding of the King of Kings. Because you see, what 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is depicting, the coming of the Christ to gather his saints, to dwell with his saints forever, is the picture of Matthew chapter 25, 1 to 13. It's not the removal of the church from the earth at some proposed end of time in fulfillment of some promises made to the church, divorced, pun intended, from Israel. One of the greatest theological blunders, one of the worst theological errors is the view that God was through with Israel at the cross. It is the view that God, on the day of Pentecost, was establishing the church as an entity totally unrelated to God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. And yet that's kind of funny, isn't it? And let me remind you, I was raised in the amillennial view of the churches of Christ, which then, when I was a young man, and still to this day, insists that God was through with Israel at the cross, through with the Old Covenant at the cross. And yet, that same fellowship, along with many others, by the way, that same fellowship believes that here is Peter standing up on the day of Pentecost, taking note of the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and said, this is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. So God was supposedly through with Israel at the cross, through with the Old Testament at the cross, and yet here he is affirming that the events of the day of Pentecost were in fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promise found in Joel. And then it is affirmed that not only was Christ the one shedding forth the events of Joel, he was sitting on the throne of David in fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. You know, it seems to me that there's an awful lot of concern about Israel and the fulfillment of Old Covenant promises taking place on Pentecost. For God to have been through with Israel at the cross, for God to have been through with the Old Covenant at the cross. It just doesn't work. So the very concept of the wedding is, as we have been seeking to drive home video after video, is concerned with the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. I have to do a bit of rehearsal here to bring us up to speed before we dive into the book of Revelation, because as I was getting at in all of these preceding comments, this view is that God was through with Israel at the cross. God was through with the Old Covenant at the cross. So therefore, that view allows one to approach the book of Revelation and say, oh, well, you know, we've got a book here, a major book here, and it's got the theme of the wedding in it. That must be talking about the church at the end of time. And so the view that I was raised in says, well, you know, the harlot in the book of Revelation was, that was the Roman Catholic Church. That's the church that had totally 100% apostatized and has now become the very epitome of the Antichrist, the man of sin. And that man of sin, the Pope, will one day once again persecute the faithful. But God will come, second coming, destroy the Pope, and marry his bride. Do you see what happens, pardon me, when we divorce, again, pun intended, when we divorce the book of Revelation from its context, from its prophetic context of the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel, we are doomed to having a false view of the book of Revelation, and I would add, a false view of eschatology. The book of Revelation is the capstone, the pinnacle of God's dealings with Old Covenant Israel, bringing that Old Covenant world, bringing that Old Covenant to a close and marrying the righteous remnant of all 12 tribes, transforming them into the image of his Son, and inviting the Gentiles to the wedding banquet, just as Matthew chapter 22 suggests. Now, so let me very quickly go back over the territory that is so critical for understanding the book of Revelation. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, in Hosea, as a result of Israel becoming an adulterous wife, of becoming a harlot wife, God says, write her a bill of divorcement. She is not my wife. I am not her husband. Israel had begun to worship other gods, offering sacrifices to the other gods, paying homage to other gods, giving to them rocks and stones and trees, the worship, the service, the obedience, the love, the devotion that belonged exclusively to Yahweh. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Exodus chapter 20. And so as a result of that disobedience, the book of Hosea depicts for us a threefold, actually six, but you'll see what I mean. A threefold reality. God was going to divorce the 10 northern tribes. He was going to depart from her, abandon her covenantally, and put her to death. Divorce, departure, death. However, God in his graciousness, God in his matchless mercy, said the time was coming, which will be in the last days, Hosea chapter 3, 4, and 5, in which God would remarry Israel. You know, God said, Hosea chapter 5, 14 and following, I will depart and go back to my place until they repent. That's the departure. In the meantime, he was going to kill them. But after 3 days, he will raise us up and we will live in his presence. Hosea 6, verses 1 to 3. Which shows us the corporate nature of the resurrection, because the New Testament writers apply that text to Jesus' resurrection on the third day. Well, Hosea is talking about the nation. Not the nationalistic nation, but the nation reborn, resurrected. In other words, the righteous remnant. He will, after 3 days, he will raise us up. The resurrection of Jesus is a representative sign of the resurrection of Israel that had begun. Well, I can't spend any more time on that. But the point of it is, ladies and gentlemen, God said, I'm going to divorce you, I'm going to depart from you, I'm going to put you to death, but I'm going to raise you from the dead. However, in the last days, I will betroth you again to me in righteousness. I will betroth you to me forever. Hosea 2, 19 to 23. Oh, it would be in the days of the new covenant. Hosea chapter 2 and verse 18. In that day of the resurrection, the restoration, and the remarriage of Israel, other prophetic books represent it as the remarriage of all 12 tribes. Because you see, according to Jeremiah chapter 3, 8 and following, actually verses 1 to 16, God knew that he could not divorce Judah, even though she was worse than Israel. But he couldn't divorce her. Why? because of the Messiah. The Messiah had to come through Judah. And so, even though Judah was worse at the time, God could not divorce her until the Messiah came. Well, here comes Jesus, centuries later. Judah and Jerusalem are horrifically evil. So much so that in Matthew chapter 12, Matthew chapter 16, Jesus called them the wicked and adulterous generation. What did God do with the 10 northern tribes when they became an adulterous generation? What did he do? He divorced them, he departed, and he put them to death. But he promised, you see, in the parallel passage, by the way, of the book of Amos, although he was going to destroy the kingdom and the nation of Israel, he wasn't going to destroy the family of Israel. He was going to preserve the righteous remnant. But when we come to the New Testament, we find Israel is now the adulterous generation, the adulterous wife, once again, which demanded that God divorce her. That was the law. And I want to suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, the book of Revelation is, in fact, the chronicling of the divorce, the departure, and the death of Old Covenant Judah, the nationalistic form of Judah, the kingdom of Judah, and yet the remarriage of the whole house of Israel, transformed into the image of Christ. That's all the time I've got for today. Don't forget, for the rest of this month, which is almost up, by the way, you want to take advantage of this fantastic two-book special. We shall meet him in the air, The Wedding of the King of Kings. This book goes into great detail about God's divorce and remarriage, how that could take place, what was necessary, a bunch of issues that we're going to fill in tomorrow, as well as my book, The Resurrection of Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, Fulfilled or Future. If you purchase these books separately, it would cost you $57, $58. For the rest of May 2023 only. U.S. orders only, okay? Total delivered price, $39.95. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. Order the books. You'll be glad you did. Okay? Thanks for joining me. We'll go to the book of Revelation and talk about the wedding on the flip side.